This episode is sponsored by Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back, and this is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This is going to be, I think, the first 2025 episode? Is that right? I think it is.
Yeah, it is. Because last week's episode would have been on the 30th, I think.
Yes, that's right. They were just shy of the holidays because it's for light holiday listening, as we said in the episode. Right, so we're going to be talking about, I think I may have said the title already, but I'm going to say it again. Client-side versus server-side JavaScript. So we're going to be talking about what those things are, what the differences are with some strong definitions. So then we're going to also talk about when to use what, and what. I'm going to use this in this situation. We'd use this in this other situation. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. Now, Mike, you are actually recording in a slightly different location, so you're going to sound a little different. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So over the holidays, we moved my daughter into my office, and we moved me into our bedroom. So we only have a 2-bedroom apartment right now, and this is kind of how we had to do it. But so yeah, I'll be a little bit echoey, I think, and a little bit harsh because I haven't set up all my dampening, like audio dampening panels yet. So hopefully by next week's episode, I will have that remedied and be a little bit better. Although I am in a much bigger room at this point, so I might sound different regardless. So sorry about that in advance. Hopefully our editors can do a good job at kind of like bringing me down, taking away the echo a little bit, but overall expect a little bit of a difference.
At the end of the day here, it is a larger room, but there is a bed in there, and that's a nice big soft surface, unless you're sleeping on a board, like I used to. So with my 28-year-old mattress. So
Jeez. A lumpy board, most likely.
It wasn't lumpy.
I ever checked your bed out.
Yeah, Mike, you checking my 28-year-old. No, I slept in the crevice, I guess, crevice that grew as I did.
God. Okay. Well, I'm glad that you got a new bed. But yes, you are right. I do have a bed here. I have a bunch of closets and stuff like that. And I will be putting up, again, some sound dampening panels. Because I think right now it's kind of like bouncing off the back and coming back in. So as long as I can stop the wall behind me from bouncing, I think it should be okay. Because everything else is kind of in a decent spot. But yeah, that's it. I think we can get right into what this episode is going to be about, right?
Yeah.
Client-side versus server-side JavaScript. So I wanted to talk about this because I've been noticing a lot of junior developers, new developers struggling with this separation. A lot of times people just say JavaScript in an overarching kind of sense and not fully understand what lives on the client side, what lives on the server side. And the other thing I kind of want to demystify is what do we actually mean when we say client side and server side? Nowadays, especially with new frameworks like Next and Nuxt and SvelteKit and all that, they're being brought really close together. And for experienced developers, that's a good thing. But from what I'm seeing, for inexperienced developers, that's actually confusing it more and making it so that it's more difficult to understand the separation of the two. So this is what this episode is about. We're going to talk about different use cases. We're going to talk about the differences between server side and client side, when to use one another. At the end of the day, hopefully at the end of this episode, you'll understand it in a more comprehensive sense so that when you're looking at a framework or when you're looking at some code and you're seeing certain elements, you'll be able to detect what's server side and what's client side, and you'll easily be able to kind of reference the two in the right context when you're searching for solutions and stuff like that.
I want to ask a question really quick. Maybe this would be answered in the episode, but I don't think so. So one of the things I struggle with when working with a framework or some specific tooling like Svelte and things like that is, and we talked about this a million times on the show, is that separation where like, I'm like, hey, is this, regular JavaScript? Because I haven't, like any of us, I haven't written every single JavaScript method in every single configuration. And even if I have written a certain, method or used a certain bit of syntax, I don't write it every day. So I'm going to forget. And so I'll struggle with like, is that Svelte? Like, is that JavaScript? And some things are obvious and other things just aren't immediately to be. Is this another level of that? And what I mean by that is like, you were just kind of saying how like, people who use these sort of tool sets, if you will, these frameworks, it just kind of all melds together. And if they're kind of stumped, they'll just quickly look and be like, yo, is this like, what is this? Is this Svelte? Is this not? Like, what am I doing when they're Googling a solution? Is this similar, or is this adding more nuance to my problem? Like, is this going to become like another layer of like, okay, is this Svelte or is this JavaScript? Okay, great. Okay, so now is it client side? Like, am I going to be asking a second like tier of question?
Yes, that's exactly it. So unfortunately, that's the definition. Like that's why I wanted to demystify this a little bit, is that when you're doing front end or full stack web development nowadays, there's many layers of writing code and UI and CSS and like layout stuff that all are kind of taught together, but in reality are very separate elements. So like you mentioned perfectly, is that like what's Svelte code, like what's the Svelte API versus what's like standard JavaScript, which versus then again that other layer of, if you're using especially a framework called SvelteKit, like that's the thing that brings kind of the back end and the front end, the server and the client together. Then you're talking especially where like, okay, what am I writing on the server and what am I writing on the client? And it becomes very important to understand that separation, because as we'll mention in the episode, like a lot of security associated with a web application requires you to understand what is client and what is server. Because if you do something on the client that you shouldn't, you could be leaking sensitive information. And if you're trying to do something on the server that you shouldn't, you could just be janking up or breaking your application, because there's some things on the server side that work that don't work on the client side, and vice versa as well. Some things on the client side work that don't work on server side. So it's inherently important in today's modern web development landscape to understand the two, and to understand that JavaScript is the language that powers both sides. As an option, I want to say that clearly as well. I've mentioned this many times on the podcast before, where like JavaScript is this language that is just a programming language. It was developed for the web, right? For the front end web, and famously in like a week or something like that, the initial version of JavaScript was developed, which is one of the reasons that people kind of hate on it, because it lacks that like in-depth thought process of creating a language. There's some jankiness to it, but it has improved over this significant 20 years that it's been around, to the point where people have used it not only just for like doing stuff on the websites themselves, like on the client side, but they've now started to integrate JavaScript into the server. Now, this has been happening for probably over a decade as well, but really seriously, it's been kind of a more modern, newer thing where people are like really investing their time in learning JavaScripts in and out, like how to do more complex JavaScript operations, because whenever you talk server side, you might be talking about doing some heavy calculations. You might be doing stuff that isn't just moving around divs on a page, right? So that's where I wanted to kind of, again, create that separation in your head where JavaScript is the language. It can run on pretty much anything these days. But what you need to understand is that when we're talking about JavaScript, we're talking about it in different ways all the time. Like when we're talking web development, framework side JavaScript, that's a lot of times we're talking client side. And then when you're talking full stack JavaScript, that's when we're talking like more server side stuff and stuff. But that kind of transitioned me perfectly into the first segment here, which is the basics. So I've already described what JavaScript is, right? It's the language that powers the web, but it can also be used in any way that you want. It's a programming language. And what I want to do now is really define what client side and server side is when we reference it. So client side is code that runs directly in a user's browser, right? So it's not running anywhere outside of a user's computer. I want to say, like, when you're running client side code is running on their computer. There's nothing outside of it that's powering it to access anything outside, like a server or an API. It requires you to like connect with that server through an API layer or through some sort of a, AJAX request or a fetch request, whatever. But everything else is running directly in the person's browser. It's often focused on rendering visuals, right? Managing user interaction within a browser environment, right? Like that's why JavaScript was developed, was allowing you to like click a button and something on the screen happens and shows you, a graph or something, right? Internally, or like do a quiz and you give different answers and it takes you to the next page and stuff like that. So allow you to maybe kick off an animation or some sorts, whatever. Here's kind of like an analogy that I saw on the web. Imagine your browser is the stage and client-side JavaScript is the actor performing live for the audience, right? Like that's what the audience is seeing directly. JavaScript is that kind of layer for you to understand how it works. Now let's define server-side. This is where, again, this is the opposite, where like it's not running in a user's browser, obviously, but it's code executed on a remote server before the data is sent to the user's browser, right? So there's some sort of calculation that needs to happen, some sort of data fetching and transition, some sort of authentication, some sort of like secure stuff that needs to happen that's obfuscated, removed away from the user's visibility, okay? This usually handles like pretty heavy lifting tasks, like rendering a very complicated page. A lot of times you'll want to do that on the server. Although in some cases you might want to consider a client-side render, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in the episode. But regardless, you're trying to take away the compute from a person's computer, because a lot of times you don't know what a person's computer is. So it could be a really hefty, a really, really beefy computer. It could be a really beefy phone, and everything could go super well. But it could also be a computer from 15 years ago that's not able to handle anything. And therefore, the more you give it, the worse it's going to run. And when you're trying to create a website or a web application for the general public, the idea is you want to, capture as many people as possible. And therefore, a lot of times, heavy computational tasks will be offloaded on a server so that whatever you get out of that computation is just like some text or some some JSON object to the front end. It can already parse that pretty easily, regardless of how old the computer is. And therefore, everyone is getting a very similar experience, regardless if you have a 10-year-old computer or the latest and greatest super fast computer. So you're trying to kind of balance that out. It's also really important, again, for managing information, like secure information, because a server can interact with the database in a secure way where people can't leak like information, where people can't access that database directly. Any sort of secure data, any sort of data you don't want to be leaked has to be done through a server-side call. And then whatever data you want to pass to the front end, which is usually like secure data, like a secure cookie connection or something like that. That's how you handle kind of the connection between the server, data that's secure, and the client. Everything has to be done on the server there. Any sort of public information, like if you're trying to list the species of cats, which isn't anything you want to secure, that can be all done on the client side, because who cares if someone sees the entire list of cats? Another kind of analogy that I found on the internet, which is for server side, is think of the server as like a kitchen in the restaurant, especially a kitchen that's closed so you can't see behind it, and they're preparing the meal to be served for the table. So the server is the kitchen, so the cook's in there. You can't really see what's going on. But they make all this, they do all this stuff in the background, like heat your meal. They, fry your onions, whatever. They put it all together onto a plate. And then a server will take that plate and give it to you. And that's what they're transferring over that data to the client. And that's like when you get the food, that's client side, right? You don't know what happened in the back end. You shouldn't know what happened in the back end, really, because again, it's all supposed to be secure. And you're just getting served the meal, and you're just, eating. But yeah, so that's kind of like the basics of what client side and server side are and the main differences between them. There are some key differences that I do want to get into from a very specific like JavaScript example, right? Because right now what I explained was the differences abstracted away from JavaScript. This can apply to any language, because there's plenty of times when you'll have stuff running client and server side that's not touching JavaScript, right? Like JavaScript isn't the only language that has the ability to run client and server side. There's plenty of other ones. Like if If you're talking about a phone will be powered by something like Java if it's Android/Kotlin, or it might be powered by Objective and Swift if it's Apple. And those are client-side languages, right? Like a lot of that is done on the client on the phone, and then whatever on the back end. It could be JavaScript on the back end that's interacting with the phone. It could be PHP, it could be Python, it could be Go, it could be Rust, whatever. Anything can pretty much run on the back end. Doesn't matter, because all it does is take in data, do something with that data, and then output, like return data back. So it doesn't matter what's running on the back end. Really, the front end is the only limitation, or the client.
I was actually going to say that is like like the back end, like we're talking about back end or client server side JavaScript, but at the end of the day, the back end could be anything. Like it could be literally like a piece of hardware that just like takes in a number and calculates it and like pops it back out, right? Because basically the one thing we have to remember when we start talking about client versus server side is that a lot of what we're doing, if not everything that we're doing, is just manipulating data. And I think that's easy to forget. It's also something that's weird when you're first learning programming. Like one of the main ways to learn programming is web development, because there's an immediate visual feedback. Whereas I've like tried years ago, back in maybe high school or college, I've tried Python and I just like couldn't wrap my head around what I'd be using it for, because I kind of lost like sight of that vision of like, oh, I'd be manipulating data. Like maybe the client would fill in a form and then I would go in and do some math or whatever it is I'm doing and then pump out some sort of result. That's kind of was lost on me at the time. Whereas web development is very much like, okay, I'm going to do like a hello world. Okay, great. It's there. Okay, now I'm going to do something else. And there's other languages that do that too. Obviously you mentioned some like Swift and other sort of mobile coding environments, mobile coding methods, if you will, that will obviously make the actual app screen, because that's what you'll be making with those. Your mobile app screen actually like show things like Hello World, among other things. But that I think like when we start talking about client versus server side, that's an important thing to remember, is that we're just data manipulators. And like today we're talking about server side JavaScript, but like you could change it. You could like put something else in there. It doesn't really matter. It's the information and I guess the channels in which it's sent and received that matter.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So again, we've discussed from a high level the differences between client side and server side. What I want to do now is I want to drill deeper into what like the actual JavaScript differences are. So to make you understand even further, for instance, client side JavaScript obviously runs in the browser, so that's the front end. That's the thing that's served to the client. That's the food, right? It mostly, like when you're talking about client-side JavaScript, we talked about like manipulating the UI. Again, that's DOM manipulation. That's mostly what it's meant for. But it also can do dynamic content updates. It can do form validation, right? Like it can do some other stuff on the front end that's not just moving around divs. And some popular frameworks for it. So some popular like tools that you would use for specifically client-side JavaScript is something like React, Svelte, or Angular, right? Vue as well. Those are client-side JavaScript frameworks. This is the key thing here. And I'll talk about the server side in a second. Server side, right? That, again, runs on the server. It's usually using a technology called Node.js, although we have new environments, like fairly new JavaScript runtime environments on the server. One is Deno and one is Bun. Those two are up and coming, so I would definitely keep an eye on them. But Node.js is the typical one that's running your server-side JavaScript code. And that will run like similar to like an Apache server. That's going to run like just like that. It handles like for server-side stuff, again, you're handling data processing, calculations, etc. APIs. So it's a lot of times you're going to contact the server that you have access to. It's going to do the third-party calls to like your database. It's going to do the third-party calls to maybe integration with like GitHub or something like that, or in integration with some other third-party data service that's like analytics or whatever. Like it could access any other third-party data from the web, right? And then it's going to process that data in some way, your server, and then it's going to send it back to the front end, right? So APIs are a big thing that the server handles a lot of. The front end can do API integrations. That's not something that's exclusive to the back end, but a lot of times you'll want to go through the back end due to the security aspect of it, right? Because if you access something from the front end and you put in a private key of some sorts, an API key on the front end to access a API. That API key is accessible to anyone that views your code. And any code that you write for the front end, this is very, very key, and I'll mention it a couple times throughout this episode. Any code you write for the front end, like React code, Svelte code, whatever, or just pure JavaScript, any person that accesses your website or your web application will be able to see that code. That's all public information. So if you put any sort of secure information, API keys, right? User data, I've seen that happen before. Someone, I believe, posted the entire government's credentials inside of their web application so that it would do a client-side check to see if someone is actually a government, and they didn't understand the separation between client and server side, and therefore leaked a bunch of user data. So any information, any code you write, any information, any JSON objects you create, anything you put, any text files you add onto a client-side application will be accessible by anyone, regardless of what you do. You can't really encrypt it. So this is a really, really important thing to understand. This is where server-side is very key, because any sort of checks you need to do, authentication checks, any sort of actual storage of data has to be done on the server. Okay. And examples of server-side stuff as well, like, again, if you want to build an API, it's going to have to be server, because accessing and building APIs is kind of the same thing. Managing a user session, so this is authentication. If someone wants to log in, as soon as you hear the word login, you know that you're requiring a server. Okay, so you need to understand that any sort of logging, authentication, log out, all of that is a server-side user session thing. And server and clients can share sessions, and they can do it in a very secure way where the person sitting at the client at the computer that you're on logs in and then gets back a session token that only they can access. So only they sitting at their computer at that moment in time can access the secure stuff on your server at that point. If someone were to, for instance, knock them out of their chair and sit down on their computer, they would have the same level of access. So they would have the access to whatever the user's account gives them access to. But if someone were just trying to steal information from a data perspective, like just trying to take your, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example here, like trying to steal your packets, all of that, like from like a router, right? All of that is encrypted enough that they shouldn't be able to access the data to be able to unencrypt your password, unencrypt your session, and actually be able to access the secure information that you're trying to access. So it's very much like physical level. Like if you have access to that computer, you're secure. And it does a lot of rendering of server-side HTML. So a lot of times, again, if a page needs a lot of calculations or if it needs a lot of like API requests and stuff like that, that's all done on the server. And then what we'll do is we'll take all that information and then create an HTML page out of that information dynamically, and then serve just HTML a lot of times to the client, right? So then you're literally posting just HTML with everything else stripped out. All the secure stuff that you want to keep secret is stripped out of that HTML. You're only giving the client some public information or specific user accessible information that they need to know. That's it.
Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes. Just talking about this stuff, I was going to say, like, you can already see how there's those account errors we see commonly with accounts where you'll log in and you'll like be logged in as someone else. You can easily see how somebody can mess this up, where it's like you're passing things back and forth, client and server. We're rendering HTML, this and that. There's probably some cache stuff in there that could potentially mess up. And then lo and behold, you log in one day and it's like, you know, I'm logging in. So Matt is logging in and suddenly I'm in Mike's account, right? And it's showing me all of Mike's details. You can already see the very first thing comes to my mind is like the various times this has happened. I think Bethesda had something similar to this happen. I don't know why it happened though. Like obviously I don't have insight into how they coded, but Bethesda had this happen with one of their client support portals, one of their client purchasing areas or something like that. I think it was their IT portal, actually, support portal. And there's been like countless other examples of like people logging in and, you know, everything relying on like one ID number, and that ID number gets buggered up somehow. And then all of a sudden it's just chaos. And so I can immediately see why this can happen, especially if you're new and you're just sort of like getting, you know, putting things together. And also, especially if you're using probably code from like ChatGPT or something where like it doesn't know. Right. So like it's just like, yeah, like use this and it'll work. And it looks like it works. But then, you know, there's some of those times where it'll log you in as the wrong person.
That's exactly it. So it's really important, again, to understand the separation, the differences between them to avoid those kinds of things that Matt just said. Some frameworks that are popular for server-side JavaScript, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing. Something like Express.js, this lives on top of Node.js. It's a framework for actually building APIs. That's purely server-side. Nothing to do with front-end, purely server-side framework, right? Where it gets a little bit more complicated is a framework like Next.js, which is the React kind of meta framework that combines front-end and back-end. Next.js has server-side elements to it, and it has client-side elements to it. So you can write client-side JavaScript and server-side JavaScript almost in the same file in Next.js, right? Like they have this like client-side and server-side component structure with the new app router. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds of how Next.js works, but just know that this is where your confusion might come in, and you have to be really careful to understand what's client and what is server when you're writing code, because you can easily, again, like Matt was mentioning, put in some sort of session ID token on the client side that would then leak information to users about your database, which they will be able to use to then literally hack into your database and steal all the information. Okay. So you need to understand the separation inside of a meta framework like Next.js before you fully deploy a production application that stores user data, right? This is important to understand. We might do a separate episode where we deep dive into something like Next or SvelteKit or something like that, and I kind of take you through the nuances of where that separation is inside these meta frameworks. But the reality is that like you can't just do it all in one episode. So just stay tuned for that. If you're interested in that, in a more deeper dive in this podcast, let me know at HTML Everything on X/Twitter and at HTML the things on Instagram and Threads. I'm sure we can, if enough people contact us, we'll try to prioritize that episode higher. One thing I want to move on to right now, which I think is really important, is there's constraints between the client and server side. I mentioned this earlier in the episode where certain things will work only in the client side and won't work on the server. And the same thing happens with only some certain things working on the server side and not on the client side. So on client side, the reason that some stuff won't work is because running in the browser makes it a very sandboxed environment where the browser doesn't have full access to certain third-party, like, your computer's file system, for instance. The browser does not have direct access to your computer's file system. You can bypass that with like an upload field and stuff like that, but it can't know like where the file that you're uploading is being stored, for instance. Like you can upload a file locally from a computer to a browser, but it can't go in and take that file automatically, if that makes sense. It can't run low-level OS commands. Like a computer, a browser can't turn off your computer. It can't go into the terminal and write a command and do something on your computer locally, right? It can't directly connect to databases that are located on your computer. It just can't do certain things because, again, client-side JavaScript is very sandboxed and very intentionally sandboxed. This isn't just to limit the features or whatever. This is, again, a security concern so that if you go to a website, you're not automatically exposed to every sort of virus you could possibly be exposed to. Just imagine for an instant that this wasn't the case. And just by going to a website, it could access all of this hardware level stuff and your file system. Well, what they could do is then steal information, steal your private keys, whatever's located on your file system, right? What it could do is it could immediately install something, like put something in a specific place in the file system that would then steal your data, like a keylogger or something like that. What it could do is it could steal your session tokens. Like it could run a command in your terminal and delete your entire operating system if it wanted to. Like if it had OS level access, operating system level access from a website, it would be chaos. The web would be chaos. You would be very, very scared of going to a website that you don't know, right? Or even if a website you do know gets hijacked, then they could put malicious stuff in there. Now, like stuff like that can still happen to a certain degree. Like someone could put a malicious link somewhere where it would download a payload and maybe run something in the background or trick you into running something. But it requires extra steps. It requires user interaction. It requires you to like click the login button and enter details that you shouldn't be entering and stuff like that. Whereas if it had full access, it wouldn't require any user interaction. Just going to the website would expose you to all this terrible stuff. And some examples of client-side only APIs or client-side only functionality that you can't access from a server. Stuff like the DOM API. So this is the kind of being able to adjust what a user is seeing. Document.query selector, adding event listeners. Stuff like create elements, like DOM API stuff. Right. That is not accessible from a server. Makes sense because a server does not run in a browser. Canvas API is similar to DOM API. It's the same kind of thing. It's the canvas is the thing that you would use for like rendering a 3D object or doing some sort of gaming stuff like gaming APIs or some sort of complicated animations. That's canvas and that's front end. So the server doesn't have access to that. Stuff like the geolocation API, so knowing where a person is, right? The server doesn't have access to that because, again, it's not running on the client. So even if you knew where the server was, it's not going to give you anything. So you can't get a user's location from a server because it's not located at the server's place of residence. It's located somewhere in the cloud or somewhere in a building, somewhere in Palo Alto or wherever. Like it could be anywhere. And with that, let's move on to server-side JavaScript. So the constraints of server-side JavaScript and what it enables. So server-side JavaScript operates on the server and it does have full access to the underlying OS and hardware resources, right? Typically, this is because you're the one that's running the server. So you're either paying for a cloud server, for a virtual private server, or you're paying for like an actual static box somewhere, like you paid for the hardware inside a processor, graphics card, whatever you need, and you're running that server. So therefore you would need like OS level access. It's not a security issue at that point because you're the one that's actually controlling that server. You're not asking someone to log into that server and then put their files there. It's your files. So whatever you're doing with your files, that's up to you. So that's why server-side JavaScript has that level of access and it's not dangerous.
Just to be clear too, for the listener, you're accessing your server. Like, as we've been talking about client side for a while, and we're worried about website visitors being, potentially affected maliciously or, doing things that they didn't mean to do and giving access. We're talking about this server side JavaScript does have full access to the underlying OS and hardware resources, but not of the website visitors hardware. We're talking specifically about the actual server. Think about like the hosting server, really.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So with that level of access, you can obviously perform any file operation. So you can go into the file system and actually find a file and do something with it, or write a file, like put a file onto the operating system or into a file folder, right? You can handle network requests directly. Like you can do API calls really easily. You can manage databases. So you can go in and securely connect to a database that has a bunch of user data, pull that user data, do something with it, and then send it to the client, for instance. So you can do a lot of secure stuff on the server because you're the only one that should have access to that server. And again, I want to give examples of certain specific features here. Now, this isn't an extensive list. There's plenty of stuff that the server can do that the client side can't do. But the first and most important one to understand, and the one that I've been caught up on the most, like when you're trying to do some sort of like file manipulation stuff on the client side, you're trying to upload a file and do something with it. A lot of times when you Google it or something like that, you'll see this package called FS. That's the file system module package, right? And it's only meant to operate in a server-side environment on Node.js, on Bun, whatever, like on any server-side framework. And that's something that the FS package, the FS NPM package, will not run on the client. It'll give you an error. So it's really important to understand that. There's a package called HTTP that, again, handles requests like secure API call requests, like a secure fetch request. That's This one's a little bit more confusing because obviously you can do some of that on the client, but it's a different kind of fetch package that's built into a browser. Whereas this HTTP module for Node.js, this is meant for secure communications. This is where you would put your API keys that you don't want to be leaked to the front end and stuff like that. Any sort of database libraries that you want to connect to, Postgres, MySQL, whatever, will have a server-side package that you can use that won't work on the client. And then child process package. So child process is actually something that is OS level connection. So if you want to do any sort of system commands, right? If you want to spawn a process on the system to crunch some numbers and then return a result or something like that on the actual computer, that's only going to run on the server, right? Because if you try to do that on the client, it'll be like, oh, you're in a sandbox environment. You don't have access to the operating system level processes. You can't just start a process on another person's computer to mine Bitcoin, for example. Right? You can do that to a certain degree in the browser, but you're very limited in what you can do and how much resources you can use from that client.
I have a question here, actually. So you were mentioning that like browsers can do an XML HTTP request or like an AJAX request, whatever, for information, and you could do stuff like, you know, ask for like a bit of data from like a database or something, right? So my question there is like, you have this HTTP module in Node.js. It's for things like you said, it's for things for like APIs and whatever API keys and such that you don't want publicly released.
Yeah, and creating APIs as well requires the HTTP module to a certain degree. That's the difference as well. So you can't create an API on the front end, right? So HTTP is required to like start that like connection process, to start the actual ability to, you know, do a /get users. And then it'll process that as a API endpoint and then do whatever and send it back. So it's mostly meant for actually like creating the API.
Would a rule of thumb, like, because the API stuff is pretty clear, I would say, like the API creation stuff. But like for fetching, in terms of like fetching and using data, it might be a little unclear. Like the API keys, I think, is a clear case. But there's going to be some stuff where you're like, well, I'm processing, you know, someone's account balance. So do I like sort of AJAX that? Because I am going to be displaying it on the DOM, or do I do this HTTP module, but then I'm going to be displaying it on the DOM? Like, is that a rule of thumb where if something is going to be displayed on the actual web page, that can just be done however? Like, because it's not really the most secure thing in the world, because like, I don't know if that's true. Like, is that, like, I'm asking the question, is that a good rule of thumb for people where it's like, yeah, like you've logged in now and your account balance of your bank is going to be displayed on the page, so it can be grabbed in any way. Is that wrong?
Well, so when you're logging in, this is the authentication side of things. You're providing a session token from the server to the client, or a JWT token that's generated from the server onto the client. But regardless, there is a secure communication that happens between server and client where it establishes a secure connection through a cookie, a session token, a database session, and allows you to access specific information that you own. Like you can, you know, if you own the server, you can control what they can access, but it can be secure information like a bank balance. What that means is that like when you establish that secure communication, only that person can access that information, right? So usually it's like a user ID that they use to then pull the information, and only their user ID can access their information. They can't access anything else, and the server controls that access control and then parses any sort of information that you don't want them to see and sends back only the information they want to see. So while you're sitting at the computer and you're authenticated, you can see it. And like I said before, if someone comes to your desk, punches you in the face, kicks you off the computer, they can see your data. But that's the only way they would be able to see your data technically, or if they hack into your computer somehow, like on a system level, they would be able to see your data, but they wouldn't be able to access your data without having your authentication, if that makes sense. So they would have to go in, create their own account on that server, and then they would only be able to access their personal data, again, back and forth. So it is important from a perspective of like, you need to know how to sanitize your data, but it doesn't mean that you can't send secure data to the client. It's the point of like sanitizing and creating that like walled garden for that specific user. That's done on the server, right? So only the server, only the client data that is required and necessary needs to be sent to the client. That's all that logic of like processing the data, calling the database, taking that data and handling the secure aspect of like removing any other client data that is there. That all has to be done on the server. If you try to do that on the client, then you're accessing everyone's data as well.
Okay. So like that's kind of like talking about, which we talked about briefly before, which is like they're the person that has the key. They've used their key. They've opened the door. Now they're in their walled garden. And then now it's sort of like a bit of like Wild West within there. Obviously, there's going to be some nuance in some cases, but like that's kind of what we're getting at, right? Where it's like they have the session token, they've used like their username, they've used their password or magic link or whatever, and then now they're in. Yes. And so yeah, like obviously, if somebody were to like grab that person and throw them out of their cubicle, they could see their bank balance and all their account information. But that's more of a I guess at that point it's a physical, not a system level problem. But yeah, you get what I'm getting at.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And the person that would see their bank information, like if they kicked them out of their cubicle, they would only be able to see that person's bank information. That's the other key metric here, right? Because you're sandboxing for multiple reasons. Like if someone were to hack into one single user account, they only should be able to do something bad for that single user. If you have a system in place where you kind of allow any user to access anyone's accounts, and that would be a very typical system of like a client side compromise system where you directly access a database. If you have that kind of connection, then someone that were to steal that user's computer or like remove them from the cubicle, they might have access to everyone's accounts, and that you can't have happen. Like that is a critical thing you want to stop from happening. Okay, so with that, I think I've hopefully established a good metric for the differences between the two and why it's important to understand the differences between the two, right? So I want to kind of go into a little bit of when to use what, right? I've already mentioned it quite heavily on when you need to use each one, but I want to go into a little bit deeper. I'll do it quickly, so not bore you because again, you've already heard it. But when to use what? Client-side strengths. When to use client-side stuff. Again, any interactivity. Anything that the user needs to see on a quick, like they need to react to something that the user is doing, anything that they need to, validate that a user is entering something into the form, right? From a very shallow perspective, making sure that, for instance, there is a password entered into the password field, for instance, and show the user a error if there isn't one. You can do that on the client side, right? And you want to be on the edge here where you want to do as much on the client side as you possibly can from that perspective, right? Like if there's something that's a simple, a simple rendering of a div or something like that, that's not very complex in a computation sense or not very like heavy in a computation sense. You want to put that on the client because the more you do on the client, the less resources you're going to be using on the server. It's a little bit complex, right? Because you're now trying to split resources. Client side is almost free for you. It's a person's computer. You can load up the client with a lot of stuff, but it goes back to that issue where if you do too much on the client, like if you do these heavy calculations or something on the client, what's going to end up happening is that you're going to have degraded experience for some of your users, and you're going to have situations where they'll contact you for support and be like, hey, the website's taking 10 seconds to load or a minute to load, right? Where on some computers it's fast because they have a fast internet connection and a fast computer. You need to mitigate that kind of weird differentiation between a fast computer and a slow computer by doing some stuff on the server and some stuff on the client. Now, server side, this is where you handle actual validation of data. So I mentioned validating that a person entered a password into the password field. Well, you can't use that client-side validation as an actual source of truth. Whenever they send you data from like a form to a server, you definitely need to validate that they've sent you the right data. Because regardless of what the client side can do and show like errors and stuff like that, what someone else can do, a malicious actor can go in and actually through the console or through just, adding a JavaScript file to the website from their client, from the browser, they could go in and send you whatever they want to the server. And if you don't validate that, even though you validate on the client, it could do malicious stuff. So it could input a SQL injection script where it will automatically run some sort of query on your database and output all that information to the public. It can do a lot of really bad things. It could clear your database. Like I've seen that happen where someone injected a DB clear SQL command where it literally cleared the entire database, deleted all the users, all the information. So you need to 100% validate any information you're getting from a client to a server on the server side, right? That's your final form of validation, and it needs to happen there. That's a 100%. You need to do any complex logic, like I was saying, any heavy computation stuff you'll do on the server side, and any sort of secure data operations, like I was mentioning with logging in, passing session, like actually creating a session token, passing it to the client. That all has to be done on the server side. The biggest thing is that it's a central area and a consistent area to centralize your application logic, right? Again, you can rely on a server to do something the same way as many times as you throw at it. You cannot rely on a client to do the same thing. Server is something you put in one place. Client is a million different devices all over the world in different situations. So if you need something that's repeatable on a consistent basis, it has to live on the server. Now, again, I mentioned before that there's hybrids of this now. It's kind of a hybrid because stuff still runs on the server and stuff still runs on the client. But now we have stuff that will initially run on a server where it'll create the web page for you on the server, pass it to the client, but then any other operations after that could be only client side. So if you need to manipulate a web page that, you press plus and it adds another box, like a to-do list item, that initial to-do list can be rendered on the server and passed to the client. But any sort of other manipulation can actually be done on the client side after that and then synced with the server. So there's a hybrid approach, and that's where frameworks like Next.js, like SvelteKit, that's where they shine, is they really enable you to create a really easy way to do this hybrid, to make it so that a really powerful application can be built and controlled by the server and secured on the server, but also be kind of really dynamic and extremely web app-like, right? Like with many functionalities on the client side. It's the hybrid approach.
So I have a question with that then. So like static site generation has been something we've mentioned on this show a million times. Is that an example of a hybrid approach? Because like you're generating like a static like, a set of HTML and such on the server, and then you're sending it. Or is that not the case? Is static site generation more like something that's done as the like from the framework perspective, where it's like you're coding it up on your local machine, and then when you build it, it actually generates like those static files, and then you choose how to serve them on whatever hosting service?
Yeah, so static site generation is mostly server side. And then like literally a lot of times what static site generation will do is create HTML files on the server side and then serve them to the client. And the client just has basic HTML with some embedded JavaScript if it needs it. But there's no like dynamic elements to that. On the client side, you're just served plain HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Whereas with server side rendering, a lot of times what can happen is an app can server side render that page initially. And that's similar to static site generation, but what server-side rendering enables is dynamic content or dynamic data from a server's account, for instance, like a bank account. They can do that, like create all that, pull all that information in, create a page based on your usability. So like if you have an account, it'll create that account. If you don't have an account, it won't create that account. So it'll do all that conditional stuff on the server, and then serve you the initial page as it is onto the client in HTML and CSS, but with also a JavaScript payload that will be used to what we call hydrate and continually update that page based on the user's interaction with it. So that's where it passes that payload and it has this kind of like initial server, but then the client can do a bunch of stuff as well and continually update between the two. It's a little bit more if I were to try to explain it in this episode, that would be a whole other episode, right? Like the whole process between the server and the client side in one of these meta frameworks. But the reality is that it is a complex thing, and it's important to understand the differences, at least of client side and server side, to begin to start to understand that explanation. And when you go into these frameworks, hopefully you can understand a little bit more. And maybe again, in the future, we'll create an episode where I do dive deep into hydration and how these meta frameworks interact between server and client on a consistent and like continual basis with serverless and stuff like that.
So I guess not necessarily how, but when does someone start learning this stuff? Like it's starting to sound like a little bit like this stuff's kind of like meta, like kind of off the side. Like, is this brought on by you eventually needing these specific tools and then you do all this, or like, what is the learning journey? Like, we talk about the pillars, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Then it's like, okay, do you jump right into this? Like, this is like talking more like Svelte/SvelteKit, right? Where it's like Svelte's more front end and SvelteKit's more back end. And is that like where this sort of learning journey would begin?
Yes. So the unfortunate reality is that it has to be sooner rather than later for a lot of people getting into web development nowadays. A lot of new companies, a lot of older companies are transitioning to this level of meta framework stuff. And even frameworks themselves like React and like Svelte are starting to recommend Next.js and SvelteKit as the entry point to their framework. Rather than being like, hey, just install Svelte and do front-end stuff, they're like, no, install SvelteKit because it has some more bells and whistles in it. And you can do front-end stuff, but you can also do back-end stuff. And like, there's some controversy there from the sense of like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be throwing all this at a user, even though, yes, it is a more all-included approach and an easier to understand approach and easier to set up. But the reality is that it also brings with it a lot of footguns where if you don't understand client and server right away, which is probably the case for a lot of people coming into web development initially, you can create a situation where you're leaking data for no reason, or you can create a situation where you're not understanding that something's running on the server or the client and just having a bad time understanding, like, why can't I use FS here? Or why can't I use DOM, create element here or get element by ID here? Like, it's kind of brushed off in the sense when you're looking at documentation for these frameworks where, like, just start with Next.js. Like, create React app was how initially React was started. But over the years, it's migrated to this more meta framework path, and everyone is expected to understand the meta frameworks from day one and build their React knowledge or their Svelte knowledge on top of the meta framework. And that adds another layer that you were mentioning early in the episode where you're like, okay, well, I'm writing Svelte code now. Well, now you're adding SvelteKit. So now there's Svelte code and then there's SvelteKit layer. Now SvelteKit has its own functions and APIs on top of Svelte. So now you're like, well, what's Svelte and what's SvelteKit? And that's it's a confusion. Like it's an added confusion that you need to understand. And then on top of that, like we mentioned before, you're adding the client and server side right away. Like, so you're adding, if you're learning SvelteKit from day one after learning JavaScript, right? Like you learn the three pillars, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You're not only learning Svelte, you're learning Svelte, SvelteKit, and you're learning client-side and server-side JavaScript right away, right from day one. Now, you can do it progressively. Like, you can still do only client-side stuff in SvelteKit. And that's what they're trying to push. They're like, hey, you can learn Svelte inside of SvelteKit without accessing any of the SvelteKit stuff. But it becomes confusing when you're trying to Google something and all of a sudden they're recommending both ways to do it in client and server-side. Sometimes there's two ways to do it. Sometimes there's only one way to do it. Like, it just adds that layer of complexity to someone that's learning something from first thing, another pillar to learn inside of a lot of pillars that you've already learned. So I can understand where people get confused. I fully understand that. Like, I think I grew up in this space, so it's a little bit easier for me to understand. But I'm fully in the mindset of like, this might not be the best way to do this for everyone. But the reality is that this is the way they've chosen to go about it. So that's why I made this episode, is like, at least you'll kind of understand that separation. So that'll take you one step further into understanding the other stuff that you need to understand.
I can definitely see the confusion because, like, I mean, we were messing around with SvelteKit, or I was, and you were kind of like helping me here and there last year. And it was very much sort of like, okay, like, I have my pillars in that. And like, I've obviously been in web development for a while, but I haven't done this stuff. And it was very much sort of like, you're like, yeah, like everything's SvelteKit now, but you could just keep learning Svelte. And it's like, already that's confusing to me, right? Like you're coming from, like many people that are learning the pillars today are coming from a place of like, they don't know like server infrastructure and things like that. So like client and server is already confusing to them. It's not confusing to us because, coming from an IT background, that's not confusing. But they're just coming from, okay, I've learned these pillars and like I have, 3 files. I have my index HTML, I have my style CSS, and I have, script.js or something like that. And then I'm going from that to, oh, okay, you need to install this stuff and get a dev environment set up. Okay, now you got to remember that like this is client and server, which you're not even sure what the definition of that is quite yet, right? And then also it's like, okay, well, like let's pile this on top. If you mess this up, this could be a security problem. There's not a lot of things that are going to stop you. Like you said, some things like FS won't run on the client. So like that's one thing that like would stop you, right, from making a mistake per se. But then it gets, you're right, like it gets 100% confusing because in the past, with the 3 pillars, if you had a problem, you would just ask. And there were some security problems, like you could have an insecure form, for example, but it was much less impactful than like, okay, like we're going to start adding auth and all these other things. We're going to add all this other stuff on top of you. Like it's a very, I don't know if like saying specialized is the way to describe this, but there's just a lot of layers to peel back now. Like it's going to get pretty confusing. And honestly, I could see a lot of people getting into this industry who, I mean, do have an advanced knowledge of this stuff, not understanding some of the basics and messing stuff up easily. Like messing up the client versus server, because for their portfolio projects, them leaking their account information when their account information is just them logging into their own app to show it off as a portfolio piece, and their username is Matt and their password is password. That's not the biggest sin in the world. Like, oh no, you've logged in and now you can see my portfolio work, which has no secure information in there, right? But unfortunately, there is going to be some stakes when you're tossed in, and I don't know, we've already mentioned there's been some disasters and some problems, and I can see the issues already. Like there's definitely cracks in this where it's just sort of like, yeah, man, just learn this advanced thing real quick. It's sort of like, well, like Jesus, like that's quite a lot.
That's exactly it. So it's just you're peeling back the layers, and I want to. My mindset is I want to go to a more, teaching approach, an approach of, hey, I want to get people to understand these really important separations so that we don't have this like government website that just leaks everyone's data, right? I want people to take these things seriously. I'm trying to stop the leaking, not even the leaking, the actual faucet of data that's being just sent into the world just because people take on a project that they're not ready for and don't do the security stuff that they need to do and don't understand the basics of how clients and servers work and stuff like that. And it just becomes a disaster. So that's one of the inspirations for this episode. And there will be more around this idea of, again, securing your web applications, making sure that you have the right know-how to understand when you don't know something. I think that's really important when you take on a project too big for you. That's going to happen all the time. And that's fine. You can do that. You can go out of your comfort zone and take on a client that's giving you a big project, but you have to know where the pitfalls are to be able to then invest time into learning those pitfalls even more to be able to secure it, right? Like you can't take on a government level project or like a big ass web application that's supposed to be targeting 1 million users without understanding the basics of a client and a server interaction, period. You can't do it. And if you do, you're putting people's data at risk. So hopefully this helped. Again, let us know if there's any other complex topics you want us to take on in the podcast at HTML Everything on Twitter /X, at HTML Things on Threads. It's a very important topic to me at this point. Like I work for like a security company, and I've learned the pitfalls that come with it, and how much data is freaking getting leaked. I just wanted to stop.
Well, the one thing that definitely sucks is I definitely guarantee that some of this stuff is like mistakes. Like some of the stuff's malicious, 100%. Get that out of the way. A lot of the stuff is mistakes, but a lot of it is going to be mistakes under duress. And what I mean by that is I wouldn't be surprised if many projects scope creep up to the point where it's like, now this person's no longer ready. They were ready for the initial project vision, but now this person is no longer ready. And I would also like to say that it's going to be hard to tell when you're ready too. Like you could be playing in your tutorial hell and building your portfolio apps until you're blue in the face. And then someone will be like, yeah, you're ready to do this. And then you hop into a project where you're barely ready. And even the slightest bit of scope creep or even the slightest problem is just going to send you over the edge and like, you're not going to know. And like, I mean, there's some things you can ask. You can ask a mentor, ask for help, ask ChatGPT. But like, there's going to be like, if you don't know it, there's more of a chance of a mistake. like this. Like, I'm sure when or if I ever dive into this stuff that I'm going to screw this up a million times. You know what I mean? And it's like, I already know a lot of this stuff in terms of terms. Like, I already know client server. I already know JavaScript pretty well. I know these things. That's going to be a weird day. Like, that's going to be a very weird day when I'm jumping in and just being like, well, I just like, plastered all my, not necessarily my personal information, but my like portfolio information all over the place. That's going to be an issue. And who has mastered this stuff at this point? Like, how long has a lot of this stuff been around? Like, that's another question, I guess, too. Like, and we don't necessarily have to touch on that like today, because it might be a big topic. But like, I'm kind of like in this weird space right now myself, where it's a weird. We're in a weird environment in which it feels like people are, quote unquote, mastering things like the day it comes out. It's like ChatGPT comes out and it's like, I'm a level 7 prompt engineer. It's like, how? I just signed up. Like, what do you mean you're a level 7 prompt engineer? Like, how did you become, 3 levels from the top, assuming there's 10 levels of prompt engineer? Like, what do you mean? I'm a master of AI. Are you? Right? And so a lot of these tools are new, right? Like, or at least newish in the grand scheme. So maybe I'm, nitpicking and whatever, but it feels weird to me. It feels like people are, quote unquote, mastering things in 15 minutes when it used to take 10 years.
So one thing I do want to mention, I mentioned this in previous podcast episodes, I don't want this to be a doom and gloom as well. I don't want you to not do that project because you're afraid to leak data. What I want this to be is that, like, hey, if you're going to do some secure data manipulation stuff, look at existing patterns. Don't try to write it yourself, right? Like, go to a service like Clerk. Like, it's a really good service that handles it for you, and you just have to interact with it with an API. Look at tutorials about how to set up a server-side, authentication system with whatever framework you're choosing, whether it be, Next.js or SvelteKit. There are really good patterns out there to follow to make it pretty damn safe to build. But you have to know about the pitfalls to actually try to mitigate them. And it's not hard. Like, it's not hard to build an authentication system. I want to be very clear here. It's actually pretty easy. There's a million patterns out there that are very secure and very well tested and open source and et cetera, and services that you can just integrate with, Supabase, Clerk, whatever, that handle it all for you. And a lot of them have a really generous free tier that will allow you to do it in a secure way. But again, without knowing that you have to do that, it's tough to reach out for those solutions. So that's where like the positive side of this comes in, is like, you know how to do it now. You know that this is an issue. Go take a solution out there and then just break it down. Like, figure it out, do it yourself, and then just figure out why it's doing certain things. And then you can build your own eventually when Matt was saying, you become an expert. But while you're transitioning up, there's plenty of ways to do it in a safe way.
I guess that's a big thing, is like, you have to know it though. Like you said, you have to know those things, because how many things in a dev environment, for example, is just abstracted away from us? Like, if I go to like set up a dev environment today and I ask a million questions, I'm going to be told like, oh, just don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. And like, applying it to a concept like this, like the server versus client side, and like, messing with user information, effectively user data, like, that's a problem, right? Like, that's a potential security problem waiting to happen. And it's sort of like, it just feels like a weird precedent to like have all this stuff be abstracted away from us, completely obfuscated from us, but then also be like, yeah, but you better know it. But like, we're not going to talk about it too much. It's just sort of like stuff we do. It's like, what? Well, what am I doing here? Like, or just like we've gone from, this is just stuff you use, figure it out yourself, this is stuff we use, like, figure it out yourself as you need to, but you don't really need to know it. Just, this is obfuscated. Just learn this little section, right? Just learn this JavaScript, just learn this or whatever, to being like, yeah, but like, now we're on the edge of being dangerous and you better know this other stuff. I'm not trying to be doom and gloom. It's just a weird situation, I think. It doesn't feel like, if you were setting up a lesson plan, like if all this stuff was brand new and it wasn't in the public hands yet, and you were setting up a lesson plan, it feels like the lesson plan is like out of order or something right now, right? The way it is. It doesn't, like, usually you'd be like, okay, we're going to do this, then we're going to talk about security, then we're going to do this, then we're going to talk about security again, then we're going to do this, then we're going to talk about security. Now it's just sort of like, yeah, I'm an expert in 15 minutes. It's just my personal opinion, but it feels weird.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Again, like I said, I think throwing people into these meta frameworks right off the bat is maybe the wrong choice because of what you're saying. I I agree with that, but the unfortunate reality is that it is the case right now. So it's important to just kind of take it on the chin and not be afraid, really.
Right.
You can do this as long as you understand the pitfalls and you go with already created patterns, right? Like, it's not the end of the world. Creating your own authentication system isn't as hard as you think it is either, Matt. That's the thing. Like, for me, it was actually like a really big black box maybe 2 years ago, and I was scared of it, probably like rightfully so. And you should be. But when I got into it and I started to understand the different pieces, it became something that's like, oh, this is actually like, it's been done a million times. So now it's become mundane. So I think that's maybe why it's become this weird system where like people aren't as scared of it anymore and are just pushing people to just do it, because it's just something that like, you just look up and you use APIs and you're done.
Right.
There's no, like, if you go about it the very easy and right way, it's kind of just like another piece of technology, and you move on with your life.
Yeah, fair enough. Like, it's like, be afraid of it enough to learn it.
Yeah. Don't
be afraid of it to be like, well, throw your hands up and like leave, basically.
Exactly. But yeah, that's it for me though. That's it for this episode on client versus server. I think it's really important to understand these concepts. Don't get too bogged down in every little detail, but definitely look it up yourself as well. Try to play around with one of these meta frameworks, or do traditional, where you have only front end and only back end. That's a really good way of getting into it. I think creating your own API layer, creating your own back end actually will help you understand the meta frameworks even more.
All right. Well, and that concludes this episode. I don't have any closing thoughts because I don't do this stuff. But I do have some Patreon patrons to thank. And if you'd like to support the show, you can go do that as well on patreon.com/HTML, all the things. Many thanks to these $3 tier patrons. Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com. Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com. Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com. Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. Syntaxify from the HTML All the Things Discord server. And Stacy Mosteler from swoonworthydesigns.com. And we'd like to give a shout out to a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com, Michael LaRocca. He is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. And feel free to leave a comment or review in the platform that you are listening to this on. And this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.